Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robin Tim Weiss, and as the manager of the public sector here at the Zero Project, I welcome you to our afternoon session, Public Policies Improving the Legal Frameworks for Accessibility. We have an absolutely fantastic lineup, including 2 female ministers. We're very privileged and honored to welcome from Canada and Poland. And I think especially given recent events, inclusion and equality for all matters more than ever, geopolitically, but also in all spheres of life. So I think it's a very timely conversation we have. And I'll keep my remarks very short because we have a fantastic moderator with us today, Gaby Admon-Rick, the Director of Research and International Issues for the Commission for Equal Rights of Persons with Disabilities within the Ministry of Justice in Israel. And I'll be shortly handing over to Gaby. Before I do that, I would just like to give a quick verbal description of myself for those who can hear me, but perhaps not see me. I'm a white male in his early 30s. I have a short cropped beard, hair which is receding because I am getting older. I have a cast in my right hand due to a recent hand injury. I'm wearing a blue-white striped dress shirt and a dark green tie. And I have a blue lanyard around my neck. So welcome everyone, and now without further ado, over to our wonderful moderator, Gaby Admon-Rick.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks for introduction. So my name is Gaby Admon-Rick, and thank you everybody for being here at the panel. I'm very happy to welcome everybody that's here in the room and everybody that's online joining us, and our speakers. To wrap up what Robin's description, so I have brown hair and I wear glasses and blue jacket. I don't think that I have so many more descriptors. I work at the Israeli Commission for Equal Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We are part of the Israeli Ministry of Justice. We work to make our Equal Rights of Persons with Disabilities law a reality and to implement the CRPD in Israel. And we do this by regulation and enforcement, raising awareness and creating social change. We promote legislation and policies, and we assist individuals with disabilities to realize their rights. So it's a privilege to be here at Zero Conference and connect with all these people from around the world that are doing so much every day to change society and reduce barriers. In this session today, we will hear from several policymakers that work daily to create change in different countries. So having worked for the government for 10 years, I believe that it is policymakers that make the change and allow innovation and other social developments. The work of policymakers and government officials sometimes seems dull and slow, but for us, every day is a different battle. I'm sure you all agree with that. Sometimes we meet amazing people that are doing so much, but more often we meet people that do not truly understand our agenda. Sometimes they are businesses that have to adhere to the laws, legislators, even other government bodies. And often people say to us, it's important, it's very important to do what you're doing, but we can't do it, we have problems, it's not on our agenda. And I think all of us, we work very, very hard every day to change this, to change the way people with disabilities are viewed, to change the legal frameworks, to make accessibility mandatory and discrimination prohibited. We fight law cases, we bring the agenda to the table again and again, and in the end we manage to make the changes needed. We manage to bring about profound changes in the attitudes as well as in actual changes to the environment itself. And what follows is that accessibility becomes accepted, a normal part of daily life, and sometimes even people forget that it was never there before. So it's not often that we get to hear from other policymakers' experiences, and today we have the privilege to hear from Zero 2022 awardees from Canada, Poland, and United States, like Robin said. These are policymakers that had breakthrough achievements in the last years, and they helped and they created sound policies, action plans, and regulations. And they did it through collaborations and hearing people with disabilities and creating conversations, so I think it would be really interesting. So I want to introduce our chair speaker, His Excellency Troy Lulashnyk, the Ambassador of Canada to the Republic of Austria.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very deeply honored to be here with you today. Just to continue on the descriptors, I'm much more struggling with my hairline than the first speaker, so that's where I am. I'm really pleased to be here, and that Zero Project has asked us to sponsor this afternoon session, particularly as the theme public policies improving the legal frameworks for accessibility is so important to all of us who work in government. And that Canada is among the winners of the Zero Awards in this very category is especially poignant for us. Just to sort of set the stage, I wanted really to take the opportunity to thank Zero Project for the important work that you're doing around the world to advance zero barriers, your model of finding accessibility solutions, and then ensuring that they are shared so that we can all learn, I think is a very innovative way to do it, but most importantly, making a real contribution to people's lives. And that's why we're all here, to try to make a practical difference in the lives of our citizens and as we share this planet. I think learning the lessons learned that you have and that we have ourselves in our experience have lessons accrued. I think this is a very valuable way that we can all move forward the agenda. I think the learning component of this conference and Zero Project's work is particularly important. Governments of all levels across the globe have a very important role to play in supporting and enabling people with disabilities. We all know that people with disabilities face barriers as they seek to participate fully in their communities, workplaces, access services, and especially government services. We know that people with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed, to earn less, and to struggle with poverty. And I would say the pandemic has only exacerbated these challenges with which we're confronted. This is true in Canada, in Austria, and around the world. I think governments can indeed play a very important role, and indeed we have an obligation to do so, not only through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, our commitments to sustainable development goals, but it's also the right thing to do. And I think our goals that we have set together call upon all states to guarantee equal and equitable, accessible education, inclusive economic growth, full and productive employment, so that people with disabilities can access the job markets. We've also committed through the goals to create accessible cities, water resources, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems, providing universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible, and green public spaces. These are words, but they're very big tasks, big challenges for all of us. And it really takes a daily commitment and a daily vigilance to make this happen. I'd say when we're focused in the session on legislation, I think legislation can be a very powerful tool in this regard. It allows governments to establish people's rights, meaningful regulations, inclusive country. We really have to change the foundation of the way in which many of our institutions and systems have been. I think today's session, we're going to hear lots of different examples of how governments have developed legislation and regulations, and how they are impacting people in a positive way, and their very role within society as a whole. So just to say, I hope that we can all listen, take the examples that we have, and learn. That will help to inform as we develop our policies, our regulations, our legislation for the future, and that we can help to build a more inclusive global society. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for those comments. And now we will hear from the Honourable Clara Qualtrough, the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion in the Government of Canada, that will talk about the Canada's federal accessibility legislation.
Well, thank you very much. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here joining you today from Canada. I'm speaking to you from the traditional Indigenous territory of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam First Nations. A quick description, I'm a blonde woman with glasses. I'm not going to tell you my age or talk about my hairline. I'm wearing a blazer and a pink shirt, and I'm joining you from my home office with a file cabinet and Canada flag in the background. I'm also a person with a disability. So, thank you very much, Ambassador Lulashnyk, for your remarks. It's great to see everyone here today and know that many more are listening and watching on YouTube. It's an honor to be here representing Canada on the Zero Project podium among colleagues who are sharing their country's exciting work in the field of accessibility and disability inclusion. I believe very strongly it's best expressed in our government's actions, our policies, our legislation and investments. But I want to say very directly today that the successful inclusion of persons with disabilities at home and around the world is a priority for Canada. We'll continue to serve the international community as both an example and a partner in this vital work. I also want to thank the Zero Project for acknowledging the Accessible Canada Act for the innovative, impactful, and scalable change it is creating. As Canada's first ever cabinet minister responsible for disability inclusion, and as I said, a person with a disability myself, it was really a proud moment to have shepherded this legislation through our House of Commons and to be leading on its implementation. In the spirit of, what we are now truncating to nothing without us, this law was developed with input from thousands of Canadians with disabilities, advocacy organizations, Indigenous communities, and others. And as you know, that input is critical to its success. And it always puts a smile on my face when I hear from a disability community member that they can see their input reflected in this law. So while I'm here representing Canada, I share this award with all those who informed, implemented, upheld, and continue to strengthen the Accessible Canada Act every day. And with the many advocates and disability leaders who came before us and paved the way for someone like me to be a cabinet minister. I'm on slide 3. So before entering politics, I was a human rights lawyer and disability rights advocate. And I firmly believe that the Accessible Canada Act is the most significant advancement in disability rights in Canada since our Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted in 1982. While it's too early to say this authoritatively, I predict that this law will eventually reach quasi-constitutional status in Canada. The Accessible Canada Act has an objective of making Canada barrier-free by 2040. It establishes a proactive system of accessibility standards, accessibility plans, and barrier identification and removal that, as a companion to our domestic human rights framework, over time will reduce significantly the discrimination faced by our citizens with disabilities. But it also does more. It entrenches 7 core principles of accessibility and inclusion that have already begun to guide the development of and language within other federal laws. So these includes principles like all persons must have the same opportunities to make for themselves the lives that they are able and wish to, regardless of their disabilities. That person must have barrier-free access to full and equal participation in society, regardless of disability. And that persons with disabilities must be involved in the development and design of laws, policies, programs, services, and structures. The Accessible Canada Act also contains a definition of disability modeled after the one in the UNCRPD, which we are standardizing across federal government programs and services. The Act also created our annual National Accessibility Week, which celebrates the contributions of Canadians with disabilities and challenges all of us to continue to advance disability rights and disability inclusion. The Act established our Canadian Human Rights Commission as the monitoring body of the implementation of the UNCRPD and establishes in law 2 additional key positions: an Accessibility Commissioner to work within our human rights structure to advise on the administration and enforcement of the Act, and a Chief Accessibility Officer to advise the Minister, in this case me, on issues related to accessibility and disability inclusion. And finally, the Act recognizes American Sign Language, the Langue des Signes Québécois, and Indigenous Sign Language as the first languages of Canadians who are deaf. I'm happy to report that in December of 2021, after extensive consultations, we've published the first regulations under the Act. You know, we've also leaned heavily on the lessons learned from the development and the principles enshrined in the Accessible Canada Act in our pandemic response. We created a COVID-19 disability advisory group to advise me as minister on the lived experiences of persons with disabilities to then inform our government's response. And all of our supports and policies were reviewed through a disability lens because of this. And thanks to the advocacy and advice of the disability community throughout this time, in addition to targeted pandemic responses, other important policy work has emerged and progressed over the past couple of years. And this includes the development of Canada's first ever Disability Inclusion Action Plan, which is founded on the principles of the Accessible Canada Act and seeks to address the longstanding inequities and discrimination that exists within our systems. So the pillars of this plan are financial security, employment, accessible communities, and a modern approach to disability within government. And we're currently working with the disability community on this plan. As a country, we're also addressing the uncomfortable truth that persons with disabilities are far more likely to live in poverty than other Canadians. And that's why a cornerstone of our action plan is a new Canada Disability Benefit, a guaranteed directly monthly income supplement that will lift hundreds of thousands of working age persons with disabilities out of poverty. And we're working to table this legislation on the benefit as soon as possible. So I'll stop there and thank you for letting me share our journey with you. It hasn't always been easy, and of course there's always more work to do, but I'm proud of what we're achieving as a country, and I'm always keen to learn from others as we work together to create a barrier-free world. And once again, thank you for recognition of Canada and what we've done and what we're doing. And I look real forward to learning from my Polish and American colleagues and to hearing the questions from the room. So I'll stop here and pass it back to you, Robin.
Thank you so much for those remarks. It's a privilege to have you on this panel and to hear about your work. I know the effort and the partnership and the persistence needed to pass such a law and implement it, so it's really good to have you here. For our next speaker, Robin will.
Thank you for that, Gaby, and also a big thank you to Minister Qualtrough for a very thorough presentation of everything which is included in the federal accessibility legislation in Canada, and really great to see the progress and the great strides you have taken. So a big also applause here from the room in Vienna. Gaby was very nervous and sweating about the pronunciation of our next speaker, so she has kindly asked me to jump in, and I will do my utmost to try and correctly pronounce our next speaker's name. And I asked the Minister and the Secretary of State for forgiveness if I get her name wrong, but we're very honored and privileged to have Mrs. Małgorzata Jarosińska-Jedynak with us, who is the Secretary of State at the Ministry of Development Funds and Regional Policy in Poland. And she'll be talking about the program Accessibility Plus, another Zero Project Awardee, and we very much look forward to hearing from her and the progress made in Poland.
Thank you very much. Hello, guys. The pronunciation was very well, Małgorzata Jarosińska-Jedynak exactly, but it was really nice. Thank you very much, and it's very nice to see you here. I will describe myself as well. I'm a woman with glasses too. I have long black hair and I'm wearing a yellow jacket because it's the color of Accessibility Plus program. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate at this conference. It's also my pleasure to outline Polish achievements attained in the framework of the Accessibility Plus program, which is coordinated by the Ministry of Development Funds and Regional Policy. Please, the next slide. The Accessibility Plus program, the second one. Thank you. The Accessibility Plus program is based on the principle of the state's subsidiary towards different social groups. According to national estimates, even 1/3 of Polish society suffers from permanent or temporary limitations, impacting their mobility or perception. Therefore, Accessibility Plus program is targeting people with so-called specific needs. It covers the disabled, but also pregnant women, people with prams or heavy luggage, those physically weaker or elderly. for all of them, but also for ourselves in the future, we have to build the accessible, friendly public spaces and comfort living conditions. The Accessibility Plus program is dedicated exactly for those people. The next slide. I would like to give you a broader picture. The third one, please. I would like to give you a broader picture and show to the impressive numbers behind this program. For the last 3 years, we successfully worked towards eliminating barriers in 8 thematic areas, public policies. I mean healthcare, architecture, transport, digitalization, education, social services, and economy. The program covers 44 actions. More than 2 billion euros has already been spent on the implementation of accessibility in more than 100 projects and over 1,100 different locations. Next slide. The Accessibility Plus program initiated a systemic change by gradual adoption of accessibility into various areas and public policies. Indicated on this slide. In public transport, we replace the rolling stock with one that is fully adapted to the needs of the disabled people. We are also currently in the process of modernizing nearly 200 railway stations, 200 primary schools, 200 universities, over 300 clinics and hospitals, several hundred offices, culture, sport, recreation, and leisure facilities. In addition, 2,300 accessibility coordinators were appointed at the level of local governments and various offices. Their task is to ensure that public institutions are fully accessible to citizens. The program covers 3 main pillars: regulations, investments, and education. We have also adopted a legal framework for accessibility and introduced accessibility standards for investments. Our actions have also allowed to provide many financial schemes supporting accessibility, as well as trainings and education-related activities for different stakeholders. The next slide. And now I would like to share with you the key element of Accessibility Plus program, which is an act on ensuring the accessibility for persons with specific needs. It assures not only the real and practical implementation of Article 9 of the UN Conventions into the Polish legal system and relevant public policies, but also guarantees that all investments and physical changes will have the sustainability dimension. The created legal framework is the best proof that accessibility is not a periodic phenomenon, but becomes a permanent feature of public entities. It's the responsibility of public institutions and entities on which they are held accountable to become accessible at first and serve as role model for private sector. In our program, we promote the underlying message. Accessibility starts with the other person, which means that our activities are focused on people. However, one can solely rely on people's sensitive and empathy. The law is something that protects values and principles. When the law is correct applied, you don't have to count on someone's goodwill. It's worth nothing that accessibility provision in our legislation are also flexible. It doesn't matter if public entity has a big or moderate budget. Accessibility cost can be scaled and adjust to its needs and capacity. The next slide, please. Looking at the legal mechanism of the Act, we can indicate the most important ones. Firstly, reports, or rather self-declarations, that each of 65,000 public entities in Poland has to provide on their website contains information about fulfillment of the accessibility law obligation. There is also one collective report that we have prepared for the whole country. Secondly, access officers in governmental and self-governmental units. Certification process. A special certificate can be issued for entrepreneurs and NGOs if they provide to be accessible. It gives them a kind of relief in public tributes. Public procurement and bidding. All the services outsourced or commissioned by the public entities should be subject to accessibility-related requirements stipulated in the contract. Complain about the inaccessibility, the imposition of financial penalty on public entity is possible in a situation when it breaks the rules of accessibility. Accessibility fund, new financial instrument financing architecture changes, for example, elevators, driveways. And the last but not least, law amendments to other public policies and sectoral-oriented legal regulations. Banking, national parks, healthcare, civic budget, public transport. And the next slide. And the next. Here is my last slide on which you can see what the accessibility about is on in our legislation. Under the Article 6 of the Act, we have set up the minimum requirements to ensure the accessibility of public entities. It covers architecture accessibility, digital accessibility, information and communication accessibility. You can see on the slide the corresponding examples. And that's a nutshell description of an approach that we have adopted in Poland. I hope that it gave you at least a glimpse of what we are doing in terms of accessibility improvement. For those of you who are interested in more detailed information, I invite you to visit our websites or our social media profiles. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Secretary of State from Poland, for the inspiring Accessibility Plus program. I'm sure it will make really a true difference for people in Poland and change the lives of people with disabilities in the years to come, and you will see the fruits of this project in the future. And I have lots of questions, but we'll keep that for the next, after the next presenter. So our next speakers are Mr. Michael Reardon, the Supervisor Policy Advisor from the Office of Disability Employment in the U.S. Department of Labor, and Hope Adler from the Communication and Policy Lead Concepts Project. They will talk about the United States e-policy work initiative.
Thank you, Gabby. Minister Qualtrough had mentioned the absolute necessity of including people with disabilities in the development of the ACA, and I'm sure that's also the case with Accessibility Plus. And so what we're going to talk about is less a specific piece of legislation than a process that we developed to make sure that any new legislation, rule, regulation, or guidance from the federal government is inclusive of people with disabilities, including the perspective of people with disabilities in the development of any piece of legislation. Advance the slide, please. So we put together an online platform called ePolicyWorks. And so much of our engagement with our stakeholders are dependent upon the active involvement of the research community, the employer community, people with disabilities, the nonprofit sector, et cetera. Those are all critical stakeholders in the development of any legislation or guidance that we develop as part of the Department of Labor. And in the past, we've been very dependent upon certain representatives of each of those communities in order to get their perspective as we develop the legislation and guidance. With ePolicyWorks, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have the active input of people with disabilities across the board in the development of that legislation and guidance. And so what we've done is put together a process in which we have online dialogues on very specific issues that impact the employment of people with disabilities, but it could be related to technology or transportation, workers' rights, a whole range of issues that we often sponsor in conjunction with other federal agencies also developing legislation and guidance. So we've now done about 60 of these dialogues. We average probably a dialogue per month, if not a little more than that. And then again, what we use as a process, if you go to the next slide, please, that's pretty defined in terms of reaching out to our stakeholder community, clearly defining the issue that we want to address, whether it's a piece of legislation or rather rule or regulation, determining which stakeholders have to have a role in that, which advocacy community groups have to have a role in that, which people with disabilities are most affected, could be cognitive disabilities, sensory disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. And we spend a lot of time reaching out and making sure that those groups are included in that particular issue, using the crowdsourcing platform to then engage them. And the platform is one in which we not only seek general input, but we seek conversations. So individuals supply their ideas related to a specific piece of legislation, for example, and then they could also comment on the idea of others. That's then taken over by people like me, the policymakers, who then evaluate those ideas, take a look at how their viability related to the budget and all sorts of other related criteria that we have to look at. And then from those ideas, make our own assessment as to which are the most viable and which we should include and which we should exclude. We do an analysis of that that's pretty detailed, sorry. And then we develop a report that then is then provided back to all of the participants so that they can see very clearly the process that we used, the ideas that we considered, and then the next steps that we were taking. That's all then, the most important part of that comes at the end when we then take action, when we develop that policy, when we develop that guidance with this new input. Next slide, please. Very quickly, this is just a snapshot of the numbers of dialogues that we've done. Again, we've done more than 60 dialogues. We've included the participation of almost 27,000 individuals and agency representatives and advocacy group representatives, et cetera, have come up with more than 6,000 ideas that they developed, submitted to us. And then almost more importantly, about 12,000 comments on those ideas. So individuals, organizations, et cetera, reacting to those particular ideas. And then I'm going to now turn it over to Hope Adler, who is our contractor with Concepts Communications, who is the person most responsible for actually implementing the process that we use. So if we can advance to the next slide and turn it over to Hope, please.
Hello, everyone. Just quickly to add on to what Mike said and others have talked about, the need to include people in the conversation around creating legislation. So this is an example of a recent online dialogue that we did, and this one was advancing worker equity. In this case, the Department of Labor was seeking input from stakeholders on ways to promote equity across the U.S. workforce through worker-focused policies, employment support programs, and federal procurement. For this dialogue, as with all our dialogues, it was vital that we hear from individuals with disabilities, that they were part of the conversation and those that represent them. Again, as Mike mentioned, the U.S. Department of Labor strongly believes in participatory policymaking and that all its constituents, including people with disabilities, should be part of the discussion about the policies that affect them. ePolicyWorks crowdsourcing tool is fully accessible, and it allows for, as Mike said, the submission ideas and comments and votes. This dialogue was closed, so at this point, when the dialogue is over, people can come back and view the summary report that Mike discussed that talks about kind of the themes and ideas we heard, as well as they can go back and view all the ideas that were submitted around this policy. Next slide. This slide shows kind of what the participants see. These are our topics. We use the topics to guide the conversation, to kind of let the participants know what kind of information ideas we're looking for. As you can see in all these topics, we highlight the issues around equity and inclusion. Next slide. So this slide is 2 sample ideas. Just wanted to share kind of what the ideas look like in the dialogue. And in this case, not only do we hear from individuals with disabilities, caretakers, stakeholders in that way, we also do hear from organizations, advocacy groups, agencies. And in this case, these were ideas submitted by the National Employment Law Project, which is a leading advocacy organization with the mission to build a just and inclusive economy where all workers have expansive rights and thrive in good jobs. The second idea here, as an example, was submitted by a private company, Circa, that works on diversity recruitment and human resource compliance. So just as an example of the different types of ideas, what they look like, and who we hear from. Next slide. I don't think we're on the right one. Back one. The slide, yes. So these are to show you, as Mike mentioned, there's conversation under the ideas. I think one of the most valuable aspects of ePolicyWorks' accessible crowdsourcing tool is the fact that it allows for conversation under each idea, where individuals can build on the idea, can share their insights. Often in the United States, we get state representatives who say, yes, we've tried that in our community. It worked, it didn't work. This is how we, crafted the legislation locally. It also gives the opportunity for the hosts or the policymakers to acknowledge participants, highlight resources. The federal government can share what they're doing. They can answer questions. And it just allows for a much more robust result. Next slide. This is, we do have a website where we have a library of all our 60 dialogues, and they've been on a wide variety of topics all around disability employment policy. We also have a very active Twitter account where we post about a variety of disability and employment issues. If you go to our website, we have a short video that talks about the initiative, as well as an up-to-date fact sheet that you can download that talks about a lot of what we went over today. Next slide. And then you can contact us directly. One thing we feel strongly about is that it's very replicable, this process of gathering input, and everybody's mentioned kind of the importance of hearing from the constituents. And it is a very replicable model in terms of, especially with COVID, when there's much less opportunity, or there was much less opportunity to meet in person. This is a way to gather input online from people's home, from wherever they are. That's it from me.
Thank you. That's a really interesting project. I know that creating this dialogue is always a challenge, and hearing people with disabilities, so it's very interesting to hear about your platform. And maybe when we go into the questions, I'd like to hear what kind of policies were implemented following these comments, so these dialogues. So I think we'll open it to questions, maybe first from the room, then from each other on the panel. So are there any questions?
I think, Gaby, as we scan the room and give people a chance to think of some questions, I'll take Hope's last comment about replication. And I think that's a really valid point she raised, because all the work of our Zero Project Awardees is marked exactly by replication. So the ability to apply these good practices around the world. So I think first question I would like to ask to all our speakers who are joining us virtually is, what specific parts of your legislation or what specific parts of your projects do you think are specifically replicable abroad? What you see as being part of your legislation, which you say this easily could be done and taken from Poland to Nepal, from Nepal to Mozambique, from Mozambique to Ecuador, around the world. So we would love to hear from our speakers, what is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to replication in your legislation?
This is Mike Reardon from Department of Labor. I can start if you'd like.
Yes, please, Mike.
So both in terms of replication and low-hanging fruit, to us, it's technology-based. Technology is the closest thing we have to universal language anymore. And it's so important. You know, I come from the employment side of it, but when you talk about technology and online job application software and that type of thing too, that's pretty much universal. But if those pieces of technology are not accessible, then people with disabilities who are seeking employment, for instance, who are already at a disadvantage because maybe the transportation system isn't as universally designed as it should be, or housing or employment, et cetera, they're going to be more at a disadvantage. And so, especially with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and virtual realities and autonomous vehicles, if those aren't designed to be universally accessible, then the employment situation for people with disabilities, the community participation of people with disabilities is going to suffer considerably. What technology gives us is an opportunity to basically close that gap between people with disabilities and without. Again, if it's accessible, that can very much happen, and that's already happened to a very large degree, at least within the United States. If we do not ensure the universal accessibility, it's going to make those inequities even worse.
Would anyone like to pick up on Mr. Reardon's point of it all starts with universal design and the ripple effects it creates? I see we have a question in the room in Vienna. There's a wonderful lady behind us in a purple sweater, and I ask her to identify herself with her name and title and affiliation and give us a question to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Amanda Gibbard. I'm from the Department of Transport in South Africa. I think one of the issues that I have realized is that people actually know more about accessibility than they let on. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, we don't really understand it, or we don't know what to do. And I'm talking about government officials here. Myself included, perhaps. I'm not trying to be defensive. I wonder, obviously we need laws and regulations, and I'm really impressed at the work that's been done and presented on how to make those somehow exciting so that people will do it. Because unless, and I'll start with government because I work in government, unless government does something, rights don't happen. It's very easy for government to say, you know, you have rights, but we don't mind about those rights. We just won't do anything about them. And it's devastating to see the effect of that over the years. And so with everything that you've said and the positive things that you've said, I wonder, for every country, what can you do, not just to make this replicable, but to make it actually happen so that we we stop this big slide backwards that I think we experienced after the pandemic and looking at all the terrible things that are happening. You know, something's got to change for the better, and it would be so nice if this was one of them. And I wonder if there's any suggestions you can make on how that can happen. Thanks.
So maybe we'll hear from the members of the panel about this important question. How do we convince the governments to do things? What kind of tools can we provide?
Maybe I'll jump in if that's okay.
Yes.
I think that's a really important question. And, you know, we still have in Canada a reality where more than 50% of the complaints that to our Human Rights Commission are on the ground of disability, which is extraordinary when you think that, we also have as a ground of discrimination, sexual orientation, gender, but it's really, there's so much discrimination. And what we've tried to do is put in place a system before that happens. And I think, we've leaned very heavily in Canada on, what we would call the duty to accommodate, this idea that, okay, this doesn't work for you, but we know it doesn't work for you, and we're going to have to fix it after the fact. And trying to kind of back that up a bit and create an obligation to not create barriers in the first place. And speaking of replication, boy, did we learn a lot from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So thank you all very much to my US colleagues. But I think what we have to do is walk the talk, right? So, if we aren't hiring, if we aren't creating systems like practices within government that are welcoming and inclusive, we need to model the behavior. One of the things we talk about a lot in Canada is the burden that our systems have placed on individuals to advance disability rights. Like we really have placed the onus on making things better on our citizens with disabilities. We haven't created within our structures an obligation on governments to kind of fight that fight and make that a reality. And so really kind of showing our citizens, I guess I would say that is changing and that has to change. And now it is incumbent on us to fight that fight systemically instead of individual case by individual case. But this kind of culture change of responsibility being on the state and not on the individual. I think that's what I'll say for now, Robin, but lots of thoughts and just lots of notes I'm typing for, and I'm going to replicate all that's being done in the US and all that's being done in Poland. So we're on it.
Thank you for that, Minister. And I think you mentioned a really valid point, walk the talk. And I'm wondering, if we look at recent research, especially by Accenture, it outlines that persons with disability are the third largest market segment in the United States. So 21 billion, and that's billion with a capital B. So I'm wondering, if disability is good business, what is holding back the policy change? And this is a question perhaps I would like to also direct to the Secretary of State, who would like to bring in as well. Maybe she has some thoughts, and also to the other panel members. If persons with disabilities and are such a great market segment, why is policy change lagging behind?
Thank you very much for that question. And I would like to say that in the process of Accessibility Plus program implementation, we have identified a number of factors that hinder the process of increasing the accessibility, both in public and private sector. One of the most important one is stereotypic image of people with disabilities, their needs and their capacity as a labor force. In Poland, people with disabilities are still generally perceived as a minority that should be on the radar of social services, rather than active member of a labor market or business. Typical image is narrowed to a person on a wheelchair that stays mainly at home and gains social benefits. I think it's an unfair picture, and we are trying to change it. For example, by supporting public media, public campaigns, and cooperation with organization and association of people with disabilities. Shaping and changing attitudes towards building is still an issue here. Increasing accessibility requires imagination and social awareness, empathy. Knowledge about different needs is crucial. Therefore, we provide a lot of training scams, also with practical opportunity to touch disability. And another issue is that profits from accessibility needs a longer perspective and a good cost-benefit analysis. Expenses on accessibility might not be profitable soon. It's the case, perhaps, But having in mind significantly aging European society and growing demand from accessible and comfortable services, perhaps even for regular business owner, this price is worth paying.
And if I could just add to that, I think the Secretary is exactly right. And at least from our perspective, it's a combination of real concerns, real cost issues versus sort of antiquated attitudes that there are employers, for instance, since I work so closely with them, their actions are based on how they felt about people 30 years ago, for instance. So the idea of employment for people with disabilities, a lot of employers just think, they're not ready or they're not capable. And it's an old, incorrect view that we have to address. Again, as the Secretary said, through some type of outreach campaign. But then there are also the really practical parts of it. It's just, if you're an employer, for instance, how much is it going to cost to make sure that my business is accessible, that my technology is accessible? If I hire a person with a disability, what are the costs for the accommodations, that type of thing. And so what we've done on that is to say, well, when you have a significant piece of legislation like Accessibility Plus or ACA, you need to follow it with basically technical assistance to whoever you're trying to impact, to show that the costs are not prohibitive, that they're doable, and there are accommodations that are readily available, and in most cases don't cost anything at all. So it's those constituencies that you most want to impact, whether they're employers or business owners, et cetera. You just have to give them a certain degree of comfort that it's not going to break the bank. It makes perfect sense. It's a way of including a very large segment of the population, as Robin mentioned. People with disabilities cut across all age groups, all racial and economic groups, all ethnic societies, et cetera. And there's a lot of potential there business-wide.
Thank you.
And
so
maybe
much.
I'll just add that, in addition to what my colleagues have said, there's so many assumptions about what people with disabilities can and cannot do. There's so many myths about the costs of hiring, the costs of retaining, promoting, like being in the employment sphere that we have to address. We talk a lot in Canada about the business case for disability inclusion, about the massive consumer base, massive buying potential, untapped labor pool. But I think one of the boldest things a government can do, for example, is not shy away from supporting employers. Historically, we've put a lot of efforts into, supporting organizations that support people with disabilities and trying to find people jobs and train people for jobs and work with organizations. And we've kind of left employers and businesses to figure it out on their own. And I think, what we're trying to do is reverse that and support employers to dispel these myths, to, get past these assumptions. And honestly, employers are very comfortable with doing things the way they've always done them, because that's what's made them successful in what they do. And if I walk into your business and I can't see very well, I might do things a little differently. But imagine the possibility and innovation that could come with that for your business. And so I think governments have to get more comfortable. And in Canada, governments of all levels have kind of shied away from this, and we're trying to change that with supporting employers more and building that disability confidence in business communities to kind of tap into that potential.
So thank you for that closing note. We have just 1 minute or something left. So I think we covered a lot of the dilemmas and the problems and the issues that go with these policy changes. And I think we're all battling with the same issues, whether it's stigma and the need to really change and raise awareness, the issue of the technical assistance and giving the information to people that have to do it, and the enforceable regulations and the budget all come together to make good policies. So thank you everybody here, and thank you for our panel members, and I think, and thank you for Zero Project for this opportunity.
Thank you, Gaby, for yes, exactly. A loud applause here in Vienna for Gaby. and the wonderful job she has done. I just want to say the fund does not end here. All of our awardees and their work is viewable online, searchable online. Visit zeroproject.org. It includes our database, which includes all the awardees you've heard from today, and even more importantly, the opportunity to message them and to get in touch with them. So if you were impressed by what you heard from Minister Qualtrough, the Secretary of State, or Michael Reardon and Hope Adler, please do get in touch with them. Our Zero Project database enables that. It's the reason why we set it up. And we're really excited to have our awardees join us virtually today. And thank you again to Gaby for a wonderful moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.